right, up come the slides. How's everyone this morning? I want to thank you for being here. This is our third San Bernardino forecast event. You know, to give you a little history, of course, we've been working with UC Riverside in various capacities for, close to a decade now. A few years ago, we realized that this is a big county, and we have a lot of work and a lot of good relationships up here in San Bernardino, and we said that really, I'll do justice, we need to do a second event every year. And this, is, of course, is the third time we've been here. And, of course, we've been partnering over the last couple of years with our good friend Edward over at the IE Chamber. And if you haven't met him, and, of course, he's been up here talking and buzzing around. But, you know, I want you all to keep something in mind. Good policy is useless without good advocacy. And good advocacy is useless without good policy. And so our partnership with Edward and what he's trying to do at the Chamber is important for the mission of what we do at UCR. And so in as much as you're here supporting us, I also want you to think about supporting him and his efforts, because we really are a team in a very real sense. There's so many good things happening out there, and having that kind of good advocacy is really important. This is really interesting, being in a comedy club, by the way. I'm kind of digging this. You know, had I known we were going to do this, I would have invited John Husing up front to heckle me a little bit during the course of my conversation. But it looks like I'm going to be kind of inside of my slides, so what I'll do is I'll dance back and forth so you can get to see everything at some point in time during the course of this presentation. Of course, we're here to talk about what's happening in the economy. And it's you know, look, it's been an interesting few months, hasn't it? I mean, if you have been paying attention to the headlines, you're probably a little confused why we are even here at all, because I heard the economy was going to completely implode and we are going to be thrust into a recession, right? I mean, that's kind of the rhetoric I've been hearing lately. Of course, it all started with this, oh, don't do this to me, really. Best laid plans. Hang on a second. Oh, there we go. Whoa, don't touch anything. All right. All started, of course, with that big stock market sell-off we saw, really to end 2018. And with that, you know, you remember all these negative headlines that are coming out. U.S. economy is strong, 3 signs it won't last. Here's one of my favorite, economy at very real risk of falling into a recession by the end of 2020. That came from my former colleagues over at the UCLA forecast. They haven't been the same since I left, but that's a separate conversation completely. Of course, it's not just that. It's also all the issues having to do with real estate. Of course, every time you turn around, people are talking about the big slowdown. Everybody's worried about AV bases and where prices are going to go. I know there's all sorts of folks sitting on the sideline waiting for prices to come down 25% so they could buy that house on a steal of a deal. I'll just tell you where we're going with this right now. You're going to be waiting a long time, okay? But of course, real estate, stock markets, it does bring us back to the beginning of the Great Recession. And it's worth starting today talking a little about what happened a little over a decade ago. Because, of course, when you think stock markets, you think real estate, how can you not start thinking business cycles? But what's interesting, of course, about that conversation, let's just start with the idea of the stock market, right, all by itself. We all hear constantly that the stock market knows all, sees all, it predicts all. The stock market is the great knower. And what's interesting about that, if you go back in time and you look at the history of the Great Recession, what you find out is the stock market plunged in the middle of 2008, right after the failure of Lehman Brothers. Now, the reason that's significant from a date perspective is the recession actually began 9 months earlier in December 2007. Far from being the know-all, see-all, the bright boys of Wall Street apparently were behind the curve by about 9 months. We were halfway through the recession till they finally figured out there was a big problem out there. So you can put that all to one side. Stock markets don't predict recessions, nor do they create recessions by themselves. They just don't. What causes recessions, of course, are real imbalances inside the economy. And I like to say that looking for the next recession is really looking for what that imbalance is. Back then, when I made that call in 2006, to me it was obvious. We were a nation whose economy was completely out of control. We were vastly overborrowing money. The housing market was vastly overproducing housing stock, and we took all that cheap money and home equity to heart, and we started overspending like crazy. I mean, this was not an economy that was healthy in any way, shape, or form. And it was only a function of time before things caught up with us, which is what began to happen again at the end of 2007. I like to say by the time Lehman Brothers failed and the stock market started to decline, it was not even fait accompli. It was done, right? We were already halfway through it. Things got worse afterwards, there's no doubt about it. But that moment in time is really when our nation went from, that's not the right button. I'm having all sorts of technical difficulties today. All right, how's that? There we go. We went from denial of the underlying problems to complete hysteria around the underlying problems of our economy. And you know, in so many ways, we're still in the middle of that hysteria. If it's not somebody telling us how bad things are in the short run and how we're about to fall into another recession, they're telling us how bad things are in the long run, how we've never recovered from the Great Recession, how the middle class is suffering tragically. Or one of my favorite quotes, of course, is that millennials will be the first generation poorer than their parents. I always giggle a little bit at that quote. I mean, has anybody seen a millennial lately? Does their life look like it's all that tragic? Not so much, okay? Of course, I sum all this up, and you've heard me use this word many times in the past for those of you who've been involved with our events. I call this, of course, miserabilism, right? The philosophy of pessimism, running around telling people things are much worse than they actually are. Why? Well, in certain parts of our economy, miserabilism is a profit-making enterprise, right? The news business a few years ago finally figured out that you're far more likely to sit in front of a TV and watch the news if it's bad news. And so they make it bad news to get you to sit there and watch. And of course, politics is a place where miserabilism has also taken hold in a big way. I mean, think about Washington, D.C. Are there any concrete conversations about the long-run challenges our nation is facing so we can sit down and compromise on a reasonable basis to find an appropriate path forward? No. Everybody in D.C. is running around with their hair on fire telling us how terrible everything is, and oh, by the way, it's the other party's fault, right? And that goes right up, of course, to the miserabilist in chief himself, President Trump, who ran on the campaign of making America great again, as if it wasn't. Now, this miserabilism is a big problem because it really distorts what's going on. And by distorting what's going on, it doesn't allow us to confront the true challenges in front of us. And that is the biggest problem of all, our inability to understand what is truly going on around us. I'm just going to have to stand over here. I keep walking over here, and then this thing's not working. So I'm going to come over here. So why is everybody so glum, as the case may be? The answer is I don't really know. Look, the economy's great. 2018 was a good year, about 3.2% growth. We got the Q1 number, another 3% growth quarter. There's nothing out of balance, whether you're talking about real estate or consumer spending or business investment, debt levels. There's no giant imbalances. There's no screaming warning lights out there. Things are fine. Now, we are going to slow down a little bit this year. It's not going to be as good of a year as last year, but that's because last year got a little extra boost from the quote-unquote tax plan at the end of 2017. I say quote-unquote tax plan because it wasn't a tax plan. What it was is fiscal stimulus. And they cut taxes and increased spending. That's what you use in recessions to mitigate the impact of a recession. You don't use it at the end or near in a late expansion full employment economy, but that's what they did. As for the chance of a recession, it's still very, very low. Nothing's changed. There's no reason to start talking about recessions. The idea that we have to talk about recessions because this is a long expansion, that's just wrong. Now, that puts me out of some of my compatriots. For those of you who don't pay attention, every year the Wall Street Journal releases something called the Next Recession Poll. I love the Next Recession Poll. It's one of my most exciting polls that come out every year. I wait for this thing, right? And of course, this time around, 90% of economists polled for the Wall Street Journal Next Recession said the next recession is going to occur by 2021, just 2 years away. 70% of them are going to say by the end of 2020. Perhaps those UCLA guys have something to talk about, right? On the other hand, you know, if you fill out this survey, you've largely proven you're not qualified to fill out this survey, okay? Because if you look at these surveys, they don't give you the most important answer, which is, I don't know. And that's the real answer here. Look, it isn't the when, it's the why. If you don't have a why, there is no when. So the only appropriate answer to then the next recession is, and by the way, this is a little technical, work with me here, years of education, a PhD, 20 years in the forecasting business. Here's my technical answer to when the next recession is going to occur. I don't know. No idea. Couldn't possibly tell you. I don't know. And if you pretend you do, you're disqualified from actually being a forecaster, in my opinion. Now, it isn't to say everything's fine. There's plenty of issues out there. Labor shortages, housing shortages, market volatility, so on and so forth. But again, the biggest problem of all are not these issues. These issues are relatively mild. None of these things at this point in time rise to the level of being recession-causing. The true problem, yet again, is politics, or the political dialogue going on in D.C. Because while everybody's running around with their hair on fire, telling us how terrible things are because of the other party, they are not talking about the true challenges, whether it's entitlement reform or rising wealth inequality, underinvestment in infrastructure. The true issues are being ignored completely. And long-run issues will eventually become a short-run issue. At some point in time, we may look back at 2018, 2019 and say to ourselves, what were we thinking? And the answer is going to be, I don't know, yet again, because it doesn't make any sense how we're looking at the economy. And by the way, that is a completely bipartisan comment. I'm not pointing at any particular Republicans or Democrats, left or right. I don't really play that game. Here's what I know about the elections last November. There are fewer centrists in Congress and the Senate today than there were a year ago. And I don't care who's in charge of what. That all by itself is a scary statistic. We need people to come together and have real conversations about real issues, not running around demonizing each other. That's not how you do it. It's as simple as that. So let's get a little bit into the statistics, and I'll tell you a little bit about my optimism. Again, last year, good year. Overall year grew about 2.9% on a year-on-year basis. First quarter came in about 3%. This wasn't that good of a quarter, by the way. 3% looks good on the surface, but about half that growth came from two transitory sources, inventories and a big decline in imports. That's going to equal out. That'll shave off from growth. This really, I think when all said and done, if you scratch away at the surface, this kind of started the year out with, say, about a 1.5% to 2% growth, which is pretty good considering we had that government shutdown, which created a lot of issues. But really, every part of our economy is growing a little better now than it was a couple years ago. Consumer spending is better. Business investment is better. Exports are better. The government spending is greater. The only flat part of our economy right now is residential real estate. That is the one sticky point out there right now. Always start with consumers. Consumers are 70% of the U.S. economy. If the consumer's healthy, they can push us through a lot of troubles. The numbers there are great. Overall spending has been a very nice moderate, just below 3%. No excessive spending like you saw prior to the Great Recession or in the late 90s and the dot-com boom. People are spending within their means. And you can see it over here. This is personal savings as a percent of disposable income. The growth is decent. And, of course, people are still saving. They're not getting ahead of themselves. The consumer sector looks fantastic. This is super healthy, balanced spending. This is good long-run growth drivers you're seeing here. Now, equivalently, on the debt side, things are great. Debt-to-income ratios, we went through that horrible deleveraging at the back end of the Great Recession. Since about 2012, consumer debt's been growing, but growing a little slower than disposable income, and debt-to-income ratios are actually falling. Because of the low interest rates, we're experiencing right now the financial obligations ratio, which is a percent of household income used to fund financial obligations from rent to mortgage payments to credit card payments. That's near a record low level. The American consuming public is financially the best off they've been in 30 years. These are great numbers. The housing sector. Yeah, there was some slight slowing, and even in the first quarter of the year, the housing sector came in a little bit negative. But be clear here, we're talking about a little bit negative, right? I mean, we saw national sales go from a little over 5.5 million to 5 million. Price growth went from 6% year on year to about 4% year on year. These aren't that big of numbers, right? I mean, look what happened back then. In fact, let me illustrate this a little better. Back then, before the Great Recession, we saw a collapse in home sales and an explosion of inventories, right? That's always scary because remember, all these people were over-leveraged. They borrowed way more money they could afford to pay back, and they were playing a kind of a musical chairs. I'll just keep refinancing myself out of trouble. Well, when the housing market stopped going up, suddenly all these people were caught without a chair, and they were desperately trying to sell their homes to pay off the debt. So inventories exploded. This time around, we saw a tiny decline in sales and almost no increase in inventories. People aren't trying to sell their homes like, if I can't get the price, I'll just stay where I am. Again, this is not the same thing. Now you might say, well, sure, but every declining market starts as a flat market. Well, why would it decline? Where are the imbalances? Again, take a look at some of the fundamentals. Take housing production. Back then, we got close to 2.2 million units per year. That doesn't make any sense. That's way too high, vastly more than we needed. You know, over the last couple of years, we've peaked at about 1.2 million housing units per year. A lot of economists think this number is too low. I think it's just about right. But whatever the case may be, there's no giant excess inventory out there. In fact, quite the opposite. If you look at the share of units for sale for rent in the U.S. economy right now, again, it's near a record low level. It's a very low number. There are some more empty units out there, but these are all second homes. A lot of second homes kicking around the U.S. economy right now. But again, that number is very good. There's no issue there. Ownership rates have just now started to bounce back after years of decline. That's bad. I'll tell you, this goes back to Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank is such a quintessential example of the pendulum going way too far in the other direction. Prior to the Great Recession, it was way too easy to get credit. Since Dodd-Frank was put into place, it's been way too hard. And a lot of people who should have been able to get back into home ownership haven't. And that is a problem from the long-run perspective. But here's a little bit of a silver lining. Look at mortgage origination by credit score. This is the median credit score for a mortgage borrower over the last decade. It's been running above 750. This is one of the cleanest mortgage markets we've ever seen. We don't have an excess supply. There's not a lot of debt out there in the American consumer public. And oh, by the way, that mortgage debt that is out there is super clean. This is an incredibly healthy housing market. There's nothing going to happen here. It's just fine. Now, what slowed the market down, of course, was interest rates. But again, you know, context is king. Yes, interest rates got close to 5%. I kept reading in the paper about how high that was. I'm a Gen Xer. For those of you who aren't Gen Xers, let me explain. Are Gen Xers here? Raise your hand if you're a Gen Xer. If you're a Gen Xer, you had to listen to your father tell you 42 times a month about the 48% interest rate he paid on his mortgage back in 1983. And then it became 52%, and then it was 57%. And every time it got a little higher, right? You know, and he had to walk back and forth to school, uphill both directions in a raging snowstorm every day of the week. So anyway, the point here, of course, is while interest rates have come up from a long-term standpoint, they are quite low still. I mean, yes, back then mortgage rates were running 13, 14, 15%. 5%, that's still very, very, very low. Now, why did they go up? Well, for the right reasons. It wasn't inflation, it wasn't normalization, it wasn't the Federal Reserve. It's because last year we had more economic growth, more federal borrowing, a strong equity market, all the reason that pushes interest rates up. Now, since then, economic growth has slowed a little bit. The equity market, of course, cooled off a little bit, and then as a result, interest rates are down again. Down to the lowest they've been in a while. In fact, mortgage rates are running a little over 4.1, 4.2%. Go out and refi, folks. You know, it's still, I'm telling you, these are good rates, and they're going to be in this direction for a while. This, of course, is going to give a boost to the housing market by the second half of the year. Very good news. What about the Fed? What have they been doing? Actually, probably the scariest three words I can tell you on the Federal Reserve is, I don't know, yet again. They have been insistent on pushing on the brake, pushing on the brake. Why? Well, fears of inflation. What inflation? You know, you look at the numbers. For a couple months last year, inflation rates actually got to 2%. That's what they aim for. That's target. After years of missing their target on the low end, they finally got inflation up to 2%. That's not a time to hit the brakes. That's time to send them flowers and a candy and go, congratulations, you're doing job finally, okay? But nevertheless, everybody's in a panic. They stomp on the brakes. They keep raising their federal fund rate. Now, again, why no fear of inflation? No money supply growth. We're at the back end of quantitative easing. Money supply growth has shrunk to one of the lowest levels we've seen in 40 years. I mean, really, in a consistent basis. These are very weak numbers. They're not supposed to be this low. And as a result of that, again, in a vacuum, I'd be far more worried about deflation than inflation. Now, of course, the stock market went down, the bond market rallied, interest rates came down, and suddenly that yield curve got flatter and flatter and flatter. The yield curve, by the way, is the gap between long-run and short-run interest rates until, of course, a couple weeks ago, we hit, bum, 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 the inverted yield curve. Now, everybody's talking about this. An inverted yield curve is when short-run interest rates are higher than long-run interest rates. And the reason that economists point this out, that this is significant, is the last 9 recessions in the United States were all preceded Buy an inverted yield curve. Okay? So you go, whoa, that looks kind of scary. Now, as you go home today and when you're in bed tonight, I have a few philosophical questions I want you to think about. Things to kind of think just before you go to sleep tonight. And there's some big things that keep me up at night, okay? One of them, does free will truly exist? You know, in a quantum universe, maybe, but in a more Newtonian universe, it shouldn't actually happen that way. This is a deep philosophical question. Another thing that bothers me, why is there a D in fridge but not refrigerator? I have no idea. Have not figured this one out at all. I really haven't. Another one, is there a synonym for synonym? Not sure about that one. Monty Python fans? What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Right? Thank you very much. And of course, last but not least, if the Fed inverts the yield curve and the economy is otherwise fine, will it cause a recession? Okay? Now here, you don't have to worry anymore. This one you could put to one side because the answer is no, it will not. Look, if you look at the history of inverted yield curves, it's because the Fed was tightening dramatically. They were tightening dramatically because they were worried about the conditions that were growing in the economy that eventually did indeed create the recession. For example, the inverted curve, the yield curve inverted in 2006. Now, that's because in 2006, the Federal Reserve woke up to a basic problem. The U.S. economy, they realized, was overbuilding, overborrowing, and overspending. And they tried to slow things down. But it was way too late for them to do that. And in 2007, December of that year, we went into a recession because we were at the back end of the U.S. economy, overbuilding, overborrowing, and overspending. Claiming the inverted yield curve created the recession is kind of like walking up to those skid marks at the top of a cliff, right? You know, the big car skid marks in the grass right at the top of the cliff, and looking down the skid marks and going, pretty clear to me that the brakes caused this car to go over the cliff. No. The brakes failed to prevent the car from going over the cliff. And when you see an inverted yield curve, that's the Fed failing to prevent the economy from overheating. That's what's going on there. So, don't worry about that. What else do you need to think about? What up with the markets then? If things are fine, why are the markets freaking out? Well, the answer is for the same reason they freaked out the last 5 times since the Great Recession came to an end. The market's acting weird. This is the 6th major sell-off in the stock market since the Great Recession came to an end. Now, in a typical expansion, you might see one. 6 times this has happened. And every single time, the market bounces right back. This says way more about the market than it says anything about the economy. Right? And of course, it all boils down to one of the bigger issues in our financial markets, which is high-speed trading. High-speed trading, which is causing the stock markets to act bizarrely. And again, no one's talking about this. This is not how a stock market should behave. Simple as that. Now, it isn't to say you should sell your stock portfolio. You shouldn't. Because the value of that asset, remember, is not tied to the stock market. It's tied to the profits those companies in the corporate America make. That's what's important out there. The stock market is how we value those investments. So it's the valuation system that's a problem. Well, how about the underlying asset itself? How about those companies? Well, guess what? Corporations are doing amazing. After a few years of corporate profits being flat, over the course of the last year and a half, corporate profits have finally started to grow. And then because of that wonderful tax cut they got at the end of 2017, net corporate profits have never been higher. They've grown by almost 20% over the last year. So owning equities is a great idea, and you certainly see that in another form of underlying driver of our economy, business investment. Business investment right now is growing at a very healthy 7, 8, 9% in real terms, and overall business investment in the United States as a share of GDP has never been higher. So we're doing fine. Business side of the economy is fine. The consumer side of the economy is fine. The housing part of the economy is fine. Things are fine. You can see in industrial production, which is growing great, almost 4% year on year. Broad mix of things happening here as well. Exports did great last year, even though the dollar was a little bit high. Now, last year we did have one scare, but it was a little over a year ago today when, of course, a lot of economists, including myself, started to get a little panicked. Not so much about the global economy was slowing down, but that we seemed to be wanting to pick a trade war fight with the entire economy at once. And we all remember it started with the famous tweet. We need a trade war. Why? Because we have a trade deficit, and it's everybody else's fault. Well, we do have a trade deficit, but it's our fault because we continue to spend more than we actually produce. Different conversation. It's not the rest of the world's fault, but of course this tweet said it did, and we started out on our unilateral trade combat with the rest of the world with the tariff on steel and aluminum. Now, the biggest problem with this tweet is it turns out trade wars are not easy to win. And we found that out very quickly when, of course, the European Union Trade Commissioner responded with his own tweet. I don't know if anybody caught this. It was classic. We can also do stupid. Which is to say, we can also go out and unilaterally dump a bunch of tariffs on U.S. products. And they did, but they weren't stupid about it. They went after politically sensitive ag products, and they went after things with fat profit margins like name brands, Harley Davidson, Levi Jeans, so on and so forth. Well, lo and behold, these tariffs did bite, and people said, we need to sit down, we need to talk, and lo and behold, we now have a trade truce. And I'm fine with that. We're even talking about having a new round of trade negotiations with the European Union, which again is good news. Same thing on NAFTA. You know, we heard how terrible NAFTA was, a terrible thing for the U.S. economy. We have a new agreement now, it's called the USMCA. To be clear, the USMCA, we all know, is fantastic, one of the best trade deals ever negotiated for the United States. And oh, by the way, it's 99.4% exactly the same as NAFTA. Call it whatever you want. Rebrand it, claim it's your own. I don't care. Here's the point. Two of our most important trading partners in this world are Canada and Mexico. We need good trade relationships. The fact that we have a new agreement we're moving forward on, to me, is a giant relief. All that is left is China. And here, I give Trump a lot of credit. Look, 20 years ago, China signed on to the WTO. And every single day since then, China's gone out of their way to violate basically every basic tenet of the WTO. And they do so brazenly, as if no one will possibly stand up to them. And at some level, it's understandable. I mean, for all the broken rules, you think Bush would have stood up and said, enough is enough. You're not allowed to do this anymore. And he didn't. And you would have thought Obama would have stood up and said, enough is enough. And he didn't. Trump finally did it, so give him some credit for that. He finally said enough is enough. And it's interesting. It's a fantastic, interesting political exercise because we were the only country in the world who had the power to stand up to the Chinese and say no more. And now every other country is lining up behind us on this. No one's on China's court on this. And it has really shifted the global politics of the conversation in ways that I think are very, very gratifying. But of course, the big issue is, what does it mean for our economy? Well, on that front, don't worry about exports to China. Only 7% of our exports go to China. What we export to them is not terribly important stuff. Scrap metal, scrap cardboard, soy. These aren't things that move the U.S. economy. The far more interesting part of this picture is imports, because over a fifth of our manufactured imports come from China. And if we go ahead and slap a giant tariff barrier on them, isn't that going to really screw up our supply chains? Well, the answer is not as much as you might think for a couple reasons. One of the first reasons is, remember, the cost of goods in the United States is not all that related to import costs. You walk into Macy's and you see a pair of pants you like, okay, that were made in China. Let's say those pants cost, I don't know, what does a pair of pants at Macy's cost nowadays? $60, right? $60 pair of pants. What do you think it costs them to buy that from the factory in China? $7, $8. I mean, let's keep things in context here, okay? Most of that cost has to do with transport. Most of that cost has to do with the store itself and the shopkeepers and the inventory and everything else. But more importantly than that, let's think through the dynamics here. We don't export a lot to them, we import a lot from them. Let me put it slightly differently. 0.75% of our economy goes to China on an annual basis. 4% of their economy comes here. 4%. And the supply chains and what they send to us are long. Who's really going to suffer in the context of a major trade war between China and the United States? Not us. Not us. You may pay a little bit more for those pants, but otherwise it doesn't really mean a lot, okay? Now, for China, this is a big deal. And let's remember, China's already having issues. Industrial production is not growing very rapidly there. It's been slowing down for the last decade. They have a labor force that's getting older, that's not growing very dramatically. Issues with lack of productivity growth and the inefficiencies in state-owned enterprises. Oh, let's not forget corruption. Let's not forget debt problems and real estate problems. And all this is occurring in the midst of a massive political consolidation under the current president of China. Look, they have issues. They're not going to collapse anytime in the near future. Don't get me wrong. They got $3 trillion in the bank. They got a lot of money to fake it, right? But in the short run, it's pretty clear they don't need this stress. And what have they done? They've dodged. We slapped a 10% tariff on Chinese products, and what happened? The yuan amazingly depreciated by roughly 10%. Oh, magic, right? Now, let's say we go ahead and we slap this 25% tariff on Chinese products. Who wants to bet your bottom dollar that the Chinese yuan is going to depreciate magically another 15%? You see how that works? Look, the Chinese have some functional control over the currency. They do it all the time. What are they doing here? They want volume, not profits. They want to make sure stuff keeps going out of the ports of the United States, and they're willing to accept a weaker yuan to make sure that happens. This is a long game for them. It's get past Trump. So it's a fascinating political exercise that means nothing in terms of threatening the current economic expansion. So it's interesting, very interesting, but again, nothing to worry about. Why are we doing all this in the first place? Well, as always, it's the jobs number. It's amazing to me. We keep talking about jobs. Right now in the U.S. economy, the unemployment rate is actually the last one is 3.6%. The unemployment rate hasn't been as low as this business been in 50 years. 3.6% unemployment rate. The job openings rate in the U.S. economy right now is 4.8%. There are more job openings than there are people looking for work. That's crazy. I cannot believe we continue to talk about jobs when the problem is we can't fill the jobs we have. This is workers. Now, labor markets are tight. Why aren't wages going up? Well, they are. And no, I'm not talking about the last few months of that BLS statistic which shows they're finally accelerating. That number's broken. Everybody knows it. I'm talking about wage gains over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. Because once you look at the data right, because the number that comes out the BLS monthly is not right. It's got issues with it. The Atlanta Fed does a wonderful thing. They look at wage growth for people who have been continuously employed over the course of the last year. They call it the Atlanta Fed Wage Tracker. I always look at that. It's much better. And what that shows is the last 5, 6 years, average wage growth for workers has been close to 4%. The median wage growth has been running 2%. These are in real terms. This is better than the last expansion, last 2 expansions. These are good, steady numbers. People are getting ahead. Now, we're coming up, of course, you're already starting to hear about the 2020 election, and you know, on the Democrat side, there is, I think, 432 candidates at this point in time? Or is it 433? I forget, right? One of my cats is a Democrat, and he's running it, as far as I know. The other 2 are Republicans. It gets a little ugly around the food bowl. But you putting that to one side, you're going to hear a lot of this. You've been hearing all this rhetoric about, well, it is nice maybe the wages are going up, but the American worker has a lot of catching up to do. Well, how do you figure that? Well, just look here. Just get this data from the census. This is the real median income for males in the U.S. economy. And it does paint a pretty dismal picture. It says that in 2017, the real median income for a male was $40,000. Back in 1973, in inflation-adjusted terms, according to the census, real wages were $40,000. Your median male worker has not seen an increase in their real income in over 40 years. Now, just stop for a second. This is another one of those lines where you have to stop and just inhale just a little bit and stop and think to yourself, does that make any sense at all? Does this sound right in any level? And the answer is, of course not. This is ridiculous. It's preposterous. Are you telling me people's quality of life hasn't gone up in 45 years? Of course it has. Look, let me give you some basic statistics. Life expectancy. Back then, a little less than 68 years. Today, 76 years and climbing. Infant mortality has fallen. And I go through a litany of other measures of health care and how much better they are. Crime rates down. Violent crime rates down. Percent of the population with college degrees up. We live longer, healthier, safer, smarter. Where's this in the damn data? And of course, the answer is it's not. You know, one of the big mistakes here is thinking that somehow or other our inflation mechanisms are a way of gauging changes in quality of life. They are not. They're completely broken. Look, the inflation tries to capture the year-to-year change in the price of a quality-adjusted basket of goods. That's not easy to do. It's very hard to adjust for quality. And of course, a basket of goods is stuff you actually buy. We don't capture what I would call the broader changes in our economy that allow us to live healthier and safer. Those aren't in the data. No one purchases an additional year of life in any sense that shows up in the data. You can't look at this in a real way. And even here we miss it. Here's a basic change in life that's worth talking about. This smartphone. Now, I would ask now, who has a smartphone in the audience? But that's a really stupid question, okay? I have a better question. Does anybody in this room not have a smartphone? Nobody. Come on, don't be scared. Raise your hand. It's okay. No? See, it's my point. 85% of Americans, 85% have a smartphone. By the way, do you know when the first smartphone in the current sense was invented? The iPhone? Do you know when that came out? 2007. As we were hurtling our way to the Great Recession, that's the first iPhone that was released. That all by itself is a fascinating statistic. We still lived the last recession as if it was yesterday, and yet somehow or other, we think our smartphone's been in our pocket forever. Now, it's not just the United States where 85% of people have this. I had a buddy of mine who just came back from the countryside of Bangladesh. He was doing charity work there. What does everybody in the countryside of Bangladesh have? A smartphone. Now again, so what? Let me see. With a smartphone in your pocket, you have unlimited communication with anybody on this planet. Anybody. By the way, in video, right? In video, you can actually see them, right? If you're using one of these programs like FaceTime or Line. They didn't have that in Star Trek, right? Star Trek, they had flip phones, remember, right? You have unlimited access to entertainment, unlimited access to information. You can learn about politics. You can learn about healthcare. You can communicate with doctors. You can do political rallying. All this stuff in the palm of your hand. Now, what does a cell phone look like in 1973? Something like that, right? Not the same sort of benefits. An entry-level car today, a Hyundai. Does anybody in this room have a Hyundai? A couple of you, right? I know a lot of you are like, Hyundai, I wouldn't drive that. I would. It's a hell of a great car, right? Got every bell and whistle on the button. I'd rather drive around my 73 Camaro. Your 73 Camaro is a piece of trash. I'd much rather have a Hyundai, right? Bluetooth, airbag, anti-lock brake, 40,000 miles before you need a brake change, 40 miles per gallon. This thing, anybody can buy this thing, and it's an amazing piece of equipment. Entry-level car in 1973, ugly at any speed, okay? Horrifying. TV today, TV in 1973. Online shopping today, online shopping 1973. That was me, by the way. Anyway, encyclopedia today, encyclopedia in 1973. John Travolta was better in the 1970s, all right? He was better. Everything else was worse. Stop running around trying to push policy on the basis of a preposterous proposition. Things are amazing, and they're amazing for the vast majority of Americans. Yes, we have issues, but they're not what you think. What about inequality? I hear that all the time. What about inequality? By the way, income inequality isn't all that bad. Yes, I know Bernie Sanders has his whole thing about how terrible income inequality is. He's looking at horrible numbers. They don't include benefits received, whether it's your employer paying for your health care or food stamps or housing supports. It also doesn't include taxes being paid. But for, shall we say, certain people in the White House, most high-income people do, in fact, pay taxes, okay? And when you actually take into account taxes paid, income and benefits received, turns out income inequality isn't nearly as bad as we think it is, nor is it rising as fast. If you want to be scared about wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is where the true scary thing. Top 1% of Americans own 40% of all wealth in the United States. 40%. And that's the wealth we know about, we count. It doesn't include stuff in Russian bank accounts or Panama financial institutions or corporations in Bermuda. This is the numbers we know about. And anybody will tell, that's an incredibly high number. It hasn't been this high since the 1920s. And every political economist will tell you that wealth inequality is enormously politically destabilizing. Think about D.C. Think about the craziness going on. And then remember that 80% of all political donations come from 2% of Americans. These Americans. And you wonder why things are so nuts. Now, this is important. We need to focus on it. And by the way, no minimum wage will ever fix this. If you think this is going to be fixed by a $15 minimum wage, you're part of the problem. You have to have huge changes in tax laws in order to fix this issue. And we need to, but we can't fix it till we start talking about it. And there's very little chatter about this right now. Here's a much bigger issue, a lack of workforce growth. Only 1% per year. Why? Well, this goes back to demographics. One of the most important inflection points in the U.S. economy is the boomer generation. Boomers were all raised in families of 10, 12, 13 kids. They all went out and had one kid, which they excessively overparented. Which giving us the millennials, okay? But putting all that to one side, what it means, of course, is that this pyramid is now a column. And yes, millennials are the biggest generation ever. They're only a few percentage points larger than the boomers. Boomers are retiring. Millennials are only moving in at about a one-to-one basis. And so the labor force is barely growing. This is an enormous issue. And of course, it's going to get worse, not better. Over the next decade, 22 million more Americans, of which 18 million are going to be 65 plus. 18 million. 65 plus. Almost no growth of people in their prime working age, enormous growth of people in those retirement years, which, by the way, is going to put unprecedented stress on the federal budget over the next decade. $10 trillion of new debt they were talking about even before that tax stimulus plan was put into place. So it's kind of kooky. Now, we start thinking about the future. Where should we put our money? What kind of conversation we had? Well, again, stop focusing on the boomers. Boomers are retiring, and they are one of the richest generations ever. I'm not saying all boomers are rich. There's obviously some of them who need help. But overall, in real terms, we all hear about the plight of the millennial. Look at median real net worth. I'm comparing 1989 to 2016 by age group. So let's look at the millennial generation, 35 to 44. In 1989, they had a real net worth of about $105,000. In 2016, that was dropped by 40%, down to $60,000. And that, of course, has to do with more student debt and simply less ability to get into homes and start building up wealth. On the other hand, take a look at the 65 to 74 range. Look how big those numbers are. Folks who are retired are the richest we've ever seen in the U.S. So as opposed to worrying about seniors, let's start worrying about the people a little farther down, if you will, in the age and wealth category. And, of course, that gets back to another place we have to start thinking about, which is we don't have workers, we don't have a shortage of workers. Where do you get them from? Well, you know, participation rates are low. They're not dramatically low. Given demographic changes, these numbers are doing somewhat what we would expect them to do. But nevertheless, if you compare where we are in terms of participation rates for the 20, you do realize that there are a couple million people on the outside looking in, as strong as this labor market is. And of course, a lot of the efforts we need to do to help our economy grow right now is figuring out how to get the people who are not in the system get into the system. Take the formerly unemployable and make them employable again. And that's a big deal. These are largely younger, low-skilled males that are in this particular category. And they're out there, but of course it means a lot of training, a lot of work. Focus your priorities on where the problems actually exist. And we're just not doing that. You know, a couple of years ago, in recognition of the fact that we need to make the U.S. economy grow faster, you actually had the Congressional Budget Office, which is a great group, come together and do a survey. How do you make the U.S. economy grow faster? And I want to talk about the first four things they said. First thing they said is enact immigration reform to increase the number of workers coming to the United States. Well, you know you're not going that direction, right? No one is trying to have more immigrants coming here. They want to shrink it, both legal and illegal immigration. They're trying to shrink. They want to push DACA recipients out of the country, going the exact opposite direction. Reform the income tax code the way that Reagan did, the way that Kennedy did, right? Reform means getting rid of loopholes and cutting down the top rates, making a flatter, fairer system. We know this is good for the economy. We didn't have income tax reform. What we had was, of course, fiscal stimulus. They cut taxes and increased spending. Different thing completely. Okay, how about increase the Social Security retirement age by 2 years? That's a logical thing to do. Keep people in the workforce for longer. Sounds like a great idea. They're not talking about that. What the Democrats who just took over Congress are talking about is expanding Social Security benefits. Now again, why? Why would you talk about that now? And of course, last but not least, reduce deficits by $4 trillion over the next decade. Guess what? We didn't reduce deficits. We increased them by $3 trillion because of that tax plan. So the top four thing the government's own economists told them to do, and the president and Congress have gone out of their way to attempt or actually do the exact opposite. And this is really scary. How out of touch with reality can you be? It's not healthy. It's not good. Not good. Now, what about regionally? I love to show this graph. This is a picture of unemployment rates on a state-by-state basis. There's different colors representing different levels of unemployment, right? And you'll notice I didn't actually give you the key. Audience participation time, right? We have to have that in every comedy routine. What's a higher unemployment rate, a lighter or darker color? Lighter? Actually, it's darker. Yeah. The lowest unemployment rate in the nation right now is in Iowa. Second lowest is I believe either it may be North Dakota, it may be Vermont. I can't remember. But here's what Iowa and Vermont have in common. Everybody know? People don't want to live there anymore. And indeed, remember, we are in a labor-constrained nation right now. And one of the impacts of being a labor-constrained nation is that where people move are those places that can grow right now. It's about labor availability. If they're moving there, they're growing. If they're not growing. So Iowa has a very low unemployment rate, but they're not growing because people are moving out. On the other hand, a place like Nevada, Arizona, a lot of people are moving there, and they're growing very rapidly. So it's about where people are moving, which brings me, of course, to that far left pink state there, our fair state of California, which, yes, has a negative number. People are leaving. Now, what's interesting, of course, is this would tend to back up these ideas that California is a horrible, business-unfriendly place, but isn't that at all quite the opposite? California is an economic rock star. In the last 5 years, tied for the fastest pace of output growth, 8th fastest pace of payroll employment growth. These are amazing numbers. Our state, far from holding the U.S. back, is pushing it forward. And by the way, look at this employment growth. 1 out of 6 jobs created in the U.S., created right here in California. And by the way, does anybody see Texas here in the top 10? Anyone? They're not there. Now again, it doesn't say Texas isn't a great economy. They slowed down because of oil. But putting all that to one side, we're way out in front. Well, they're bad jobs, like that. Well, yeah, jobs, they have bad jobs. California's share of national personal income never been higher. Wage growth in the West, which is basically California, faster than the rest of the United States by a good margin. Great numbers. This is one of the reasons why we have crazy amount of money coming in. Easiest job in the world right now has got to be Gavin Newsom. Only thing he has to do is sit in that Capitol building counting how much money he has to spend, right? But he is acknowledging, as good as the numbers are coming in, they are on extremely shaky foundations. We get 70% of our state general funds from income taxes. And those, of course, are built on top of an incredibly progressive system. We have the highest income tax rates in the world at the top end of the income scale, well over 10%. Now, I don't feel bad for somebody who's making $1 million a year or $2 million a year that they have to pay 10%. That's tough. You're making tons of money. You can still buy your Lamborghini. Get over it, right? But remember, that creates an enormous amount of instability in our revenue flows because the person who's making $2 million a year in a recession is making $200,000 a year. Again, they're going to be fine, but that has enormous implications for the state budget. And we've seen it the last 2 times around. Even a small recession will create big problems for our state budget, huge problems for our state budget. And go to the next step. That stock market swoon that occurred a couple months ago, all by itself, that caused Department of Finance projections for revenue this year to suddenly look about 3% higher than actuals. Now the stock market's come back, it's back to an all-time high level, and we're back into the red, into the green. But that's our revenue system is incredibly correlated to the stock market. And I've already told you the stock market doesn't look very smart right now. It's scary. It's scary. And I'm glad they're being fiscally sensitive. We're not a high tax state. We're a stupid tax state. And we desperately need tax reform. Not tax cuts in this state. We're not a high tax state. We are a bad tax state. We excessively tax small bases and we leave large parts of the tax base undertaxed. Now, here's another big myth about our economy. It's not just that we're a high-tech state, it's that all the growth in the state's in the Bay Area. You know, about a year ago, it was announced that California had officially become, by itself, the fifth largest economy in the world. Number 5, okay? And at the back end of that, they were talking about this on the radio about a year ago, and there's an academic out of Chapman University who was on the radio, and he says this, well, that sounds good, but almost all high-income growth and job growth took place in the Silicon Valley. Rest of the state doing terrible. Now, again, this is not reasonable rhetoric. And this is the kind of stuff we need to push back. I mean, this is so far out of line with reality as to be almost laughable if people weren't listening to it and actually believing it. Here's the numbers. Between 2014 and 2017, the state California added 1 million full-time jobs. Okay, 1 million full-time jobs. 55% of those jobs, 550,000, paid over $100K per year. Think of that. Those are damn good jobs. And of course, of that number, about 200,000 were in the Bay Area. Bay Area punches well above its weight. It is an income-producing machine, but only 200,000. The other 200,000, by the way, are in San Diego, Orange County, and LA. And oh, by the way, 150,000 are in the rest of the state, including, yes, right here in the Inland Empire. So there's lots of people in lots of different parts of the state making money. Incomes, in fact, are rising everywhere. And yes, they're dramatically higher in the Bay Area, but the numbers are great. And if you could see down the bottom here, you would even see the solid growth rates in terms of San Bernardino, in terms of higher income earners. Down here, you can see how rapidly they're growing. In the 100K plus club, up 4.5 percentage points right here in San Bernardino County. So there's money everywhere in this state. And here's a little breakdown for the county. You can see overall how, well, a little bit lagging over the last couple of years, big solid numbers. The median household income in San Bernardino County is now above $60,000. Still lagging the state, but growing nicely, and that's important. And you can see the different numbers for different parts of the city right now and how much they're growing. Look at Rancho Cucamonga at 11.8%. I mean, wow, $90,000, crazy numbers there. And indeed, not only is inland Southern California a home of income growth, it is, of course, the center of overall growth. This is overall payroll employment between 1994 and 2019. And I'm not going to, in the name of time, I'll just tell you what this is. These are lined up completely right. So coastal Southern California, which is LA, Orange County, and San Diego, have added about 32% to their payroll workforce over the last 25 years. The Bay Area, 40%. Inland Southern California, which is basically Kern County and the Inland Empire, 81%. Enormous amount of growth. And this growth is largely driven by workforce growth. Again, workers, workers, workers. Not jobs, 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 but workers. You know, if you look at the last 20 years, 3.35 million new household employees in the state of California. 40% of those new labor force participants are in 3 counties, LA, San Bernardino, and Riverside. You want to see growth in the state of California, drive the 10. Carefully. It's kind of a crappy road, okay? But overall, these are amazing numbers. And of course, LA, you have a relatively low growth rate because it's on a huge base. But for out here, of course, the numbers are spectacular. So here's a little bit more local, talking about right here in San Bernardino. Household employment, again, these are people who live here, have jobs, they might work somewhere else, is getting close to 950,000. Big, big numbers. And while commuters are still a big part of it, about 20% of all those employed residents leave the county on a daily basis for work. It nevertheless has been falling over time. There's more job growth internally than there is growth in commuters in San Bernardino. And in the Inland Empire overall, in terms of jobs, has been the 3rd fastest growing economy since the Great Recession ended. Interestingly enough, after years of not growing too much, San Jose and San Francisco have been way out in front. Number 3 there is the Inland Empire. Overall, some very solid numbers, 3.5% per year over the course of the last 5 years. Top of the list, not a surprise, logistics, then construction, then healthcare. Above that, right kind of in there in the midst, admin, support, government, and manufacturing a little slower. And then you have some of the negative numbers down there. But solid drivers overall. In terms of private employment here in the county itself, right now reaching about overall about 625,000. You know, we just started getting gross domestic product numbers for counties. They're not very good yet, and they're kind of lagged, but they're just fun. I figured I'd distribute it there. And according to the most recent estimate in 2015, the county had almost $70 billion in terms of county economic output. Pretty good numbers, and you can see how much that's been coming up through at least 2015. I'm sure once we get more current numbers, it'll be even better. Where is job growth? Well, again, it's a broad mix. Some places a little farther behind. San Bernardino still trying to get itself together, having a little bit of a trouble there. Some of the places up in the North Valley as well. But you can see the places, particularly a little in the farther west of the economy, doing great. Getting in some of the numbers right here. Again, in terms of growth, 630,000 jobs. Logistics, of course, a big part of that growth. But construction's also booming forward, and healthcare is important. We're even seeing currently some better numbers in terms of professional and scientific services. So really good numbers across the board. I'm going to get into establishments a little bit. I'm not going to worry too much about this in the name of time. Again, logistics worth talking about. Big numbers there, almost 84,000 jobs, 1,800 establishments, 61% growth. These are big numbers. A lot of that is in warehousing and storage. Some of it's in trucks, and of course some of it's in couriers. Very solid numbers here. It's a big part of the local economy, and one you should embrace at some level. Now, this isn't the future of San Bernardino. San Bernardino's got a lot more than logistics jobs, but it's certainly helping push the economy forward right now. And of course, you're the center of massive changes in how America buys things, right? This isn't moving stuff through the ports. This is about a whole new way of distributing products to consumers. It used to be giant bulk, right? Big bulk containers would come to the port, and they get broken down, shipped out to warehouses, and broken down, shipped out to stores, and they're broken down, and people would come and buy them. And now, more or less, stuff's going right from the factory to your front door, courtesy of FedEx and UPS, and of course the various sorts of airports out here. And this is supporting that. You've got 20 million people in Southern California, and this is the center of getting stuff to everybody. And that's an important part of how things work. And you can see the growth rate primarily in this, in the kind of core parts of the county down here. This is some spatial mapping we've done. We work with REG, and we get the confidential employment data for the county where it kind of map out some of this stuff. Manufacturing has also been doing well. And some of the good growth rates there, again, in fabricated metal products is coming forward. Food has been a big growth rate. Plastics and rubber are doing well. Transportation is up 50%. So good, solid numbers here as well. You know, manufacturing has always been a core part of the Southern California economy. It's had its ups and downs. It's on a good run now. Some of this is new, but some of this is also coming in from the coast, right? They're finding a new place to call home. And again, this is an enormous lift for the economy. We know how important manufacturing is. And again, you can see it's largely kind of more central. You can see a lot of the big growth rates a little farther away from the coast. You do have a little bit on the edge of the county, but then a bunch of it out here in the eastern part. Taxable sales have been growing nicely. Visitor statistics, look at the airports. As already noted, it's coming back nicely. Huge potential there. Hotels looking pretty good right now in terms of increases in rates. Non-residential permits for the county have been very good. And these numbers overall are pretty good. Some of the biggest numbers are out in Rancho Cucamonga yet again. It's one of those sort of rock star economies out here. And if you look at vacancy rates and rents, again, largely positive. Now, you've heard all this good news, but it's not the rhetoric you're hearing about the Inland Empire. This is some of the stuff that makes me crazy. Low wages cast shadow on the Inland Empire's rapid growth. Outpaces nation, but wages remain low. Here's another one. Half of jobs don't pay a living wage. So a lot of jobs, but people living in dire misery is what I'm told. Now, again, let's take a step back. Does this make sense? Does this seem right? Does this smell right? And the answer is no. But of course, where this comes from is this one statistic right here. Average payroll wages here in the Inland Empire are lower than they are in the state. There's no doubt about that, right? The average payroll wage here is running about $45,000 in the state, $65,000. In San Francisco, it's $120,000. So you look at that and you go, wow, we must be doing terrible. Not really. First of all, let's agree that just looking at average payroll wages is not a measure of economic success. That's one number. I mean, if the answer that the only way you could be economically successful is if you have an economy that looks like San Jose, Well, that's like saying the only way you're healthy is if you're built like an Olympic athlete. That's not how it works. You have to have different metrics. It's not tech jobs, it's not venture capital, it's not this average wage. Are your wages growing? Yeah. Is poverty falling? Absolutely. Is unemployment low? The unemployment rate in the Inland Empire has never been lower than it is right now. Solid pace of growth? Incredible pace of growth. Quality of life? Well, I'm going to get that in just a second. Because, one of the big things here about this rhetoric is they're not really what I would call controlling for things. First of all, take a look at incomes, not just overall, but let's look at incomes by levels of education. Because it's important to recognize that the Inland Empire does have, on average, a lower level of education than other places in the state. If you actually break down incomes by levels of education, it turns out if you don't have a high school degree, or you have a high school degree, or if you have some college, you make just as much money in the Inland Empire as you do in Orange County, LA, or San Diego. So actually, once you control for level of education, there's no wage gap. It's exactly the same. Let's go to the next step. Over here is housing costs by educational attainment. And again, I've broken it down by level of education. And what do you find? If you don't have a high school degree and you live in Orange County, 41% of your income goes to paying housing costs. Out here, 33%. So you make the same amount of money and you spend less money on housing. That doesn't say that the Inland Empire is failing to provide its residents with a good standard of living. What it says is the Inland Empire is providing its residents the best standard of living in Southern California. The rhetoric about this is so broken and backwards, it makes me a little crazy. This is a fantastic place, and people want to live here because it offers such a great quality of life, not the other way around. Now, why are people out here less educated? Well, that's not because you're failing to educate people. Again, this is one of these myths that makes me crazy. Look, on the left-hand side is a breakdown of jobs in the area. You have a huge share of logistics, construction, retail, wholesale jobs. These are jobs that don't pay a lot, and they're clustered out here in large portion. So the kind of workers these businesses hire are those kind of workers that tend to be lower paid and less educated. This is simply the nature of things. Contrast that to what's going on in San Jose, where everybody has a master's or PhD in electrical engineering and is making $190,000 a year. It's a different kind of labor force, a different type of labor market. Why don't you have that kind of labor market? Land use. The high-end jobs that the Inland Empire wants are jobs that cluster in high-density job corridors. Think downtown San Francisco, downtown LA. Think of Irvine. Think of downtown San Diego. These are these clusters of high buildings. You know what I mean? You walk in and you'll see 5, 6, 7, 30, 40-story office buildings surrounded by condo towers, surrounded by all sorts of other things, all densely packed in. What's the tallest building in the Inland Empire? I'm serious. What is it? The Morongo Casino, 22 stories. Exactly right. Thank you very much. The tallest office building is in San Bernardino City. It's a government building. It's about 13 stories tall. If you create zoning rules that prevent the densification of jobs to maintain a suburban environment, well, then you have to expect to largely collect suburban jobs. The future of work, this high-end work, is in dense job zones. And dense job zones is what the Inland Empire, what San Bernardino needs to invest in to have higher incomes. And until then, well, things are going to be in the path they're on right now, which again isn't bad. But my point is you can have more of that. And I love the conversation that Mark Thorpe had here. Did you hear what he said? We're talking about commercial real estate. Well, he's right. Because this airport, this city, could and should be one of those high-density job zones. But again, it takes local policy changes to make those things happen. And that's an important conversation. Now, there has been a slowdown of job growth at the state level, no doubt about that. We went from over 3% to below 1.5%. Why is this? Well, again, same topic, same idea. It's about basically jobs. No, not jobs, workers. Right now, unemployment rate in the state is at 4%. It's never been lower. Unemployment rate in every one of these economies over here is the lowest it's ever been or tied with the lowest it's ever been. Every single economy here. Los Angeles, Sacramento, Oakland, San Jose, Ventura, Inland Empire, Yuba County, for God's sake, has a record low unemployment rate, folks. Has anybody been to Yuba County? I was there a couple weeks ago. It's nice. Anyway, moving on. People should be moving here. Wages are going up. Tons of job opportunities, they're not moving. Labor force growth is even weaker than it is in the U.S. Why? A lack of housing. A lack of housing. Not housing costs. I know the housing costs and how expensive they are, but you're missing the point. This is a conversation about housing supply. If you want 2% job growth in the state, you need basically 250,000 permits per year. We're doing 130,000, half of what you need. If you don't build it, they can't live here. And of course, as a result of the ferocious competition for the supply that does exist, prices go up and up and up. It's not a bubble. These prices are exactly what they should be in the context of the incredibly tight supply. A lack of supply has an impact on affordability, not the other way around. And that's important because when everybody tells you this is an affordable housing crisis, what they are implicitly telling you is that, look, if you look around the state, there's tons of apartments and homes for people to move into. They just can't afford to. There aren't. I mean, look at the numbers. I mean, once you think about that 2 million unit backlog, right now, California has the second lowest housing unit per capita, one of the lowest housing vacancy rates, one of the highest rates of housing overcrowding, and one of the highest rates of adults living with kids. Everything suggests we have a lack of supply, and that is what's impacting affordability. If you go out and you say, well, we're going to help people rent an apartment. How? We're going to give them a rental subsidy. Well, if there's no more supply, the only thing it does is push our prices up more. We're going to give people tax credits to buy homes. Well, again, without supply, it's just going to push prices up more. If you only attack affordability, you end up hurting supply. And by hurting supply, you end up hurting affordability. You chase your own tail. If you attack supply, you fix the problem. And that's a big change. And that's true in LA, just west of you here. An enormous economy. I love this, right? 2% job growth per year, that's 90,000 jobs. At 1.5 jobs per household, which is extremely generous, you need 60,000 permits per year. What is LA building? 24,000. Less than half. Less than half. So what does our economic development agency want to do out there? Well, they want to give a bunch of my tax money to Amazon to bring in 50,000 more jobs. And again, I look at that and I go, what are you thinking or not thinking? We don't have enough workers. We desperately need housing. And you want to bring in 50,000 more employees into this place. No. Everybody has to remember that development efforts depend on where you are in the business cycle. You have to attack the current need. In our environment right now, in a late expansion, we need one thing, housing. You remember my title at the first slide? Roofs. Roofs, roofs, roofs. That's what this state needs. That's it. Now, LA and Orange County haven't built enough housing for years. How? They've relied on the Inland Empire. The Inland Empire has been the unending source of housing and workers, according to the planners in Orange County and LA. They rely on how many people you can pack on the 60, the 10, and the 55 and the 91. I have a problem. The unemployment rate in the Inland Empire is now officially lower than LA. Let me repeat. The Inland Empire has a lower unemployment rate than Los Angeles does. It is a tighter labor market. There is no more unending supply of workers coming from here. That is the biggest issue of all. And of course, what scares me, take a look at the past cycle prior to the Great Recession. Labor force in the Inland Empire was growing at a little less than 4% per year. Now, about 1.8%. And that, of course, goes to probably the most scary part of what's happening here in the Inland Empire, or not happening, which is home production. Prior to the Great Recession, 13,000 housing permits per quarter. Right now, not even 4,000. What's going on? What's going on? This is a big problem. The Inland Empire seems to be engaging in exactly those bad behaviors that got LA and Orange County into the trouble they're in. You're focused on jobs, not on bodies, not on workers. You got to focus on housing, because housing brings people. People will fill those jobs. So again, it's a conversation about land use. And in this case, again, roofs, roofs, roofs. So prices are going to go up. And yeah, they slowed down a little bit because of the pause in the market, but they're going to go up and up. And it's going to get even more severe, and I'll tell you why. Because now we're at such a point of housing scarcity in Southern California that now every single unit that gets built, whether it's in LA, Orange County, or here in San Bernardino, or down south here in Riverside, every one of those units that gets built is going to be competed for on the basis of workers from all over Southern California. And that's going to push these prices up higher and higher. And that is going to be tough for San Bernardino businesses, because it's tough to compete with LA and Orange County for housing. So again, the single most important thing the Inland Empire needs to be focusing on right now, San Bernardino needs to be focusing on right now, is housing, expanding the housing stock. And I don't mean the affordable housing stock. I mean expand the housing stock to help affordability. Again, it's a different kind of mindset. Simple as that. And so we'll see is the answer. And you get some of the numbers here. Take a look at Ontario's ahead. Ontario's actually been a good corporate citizen recently, but everybody else is behind. Everybody else is behind. Lots of opportunities, but it takes lots of local conversations to make this happen. And of course, overall, people really have been moving here. Over the last couple of years, net migration has been basically flat. So you see a situation by which things have to change, and it goes to a different part of the conversation. So, wrapping it up, I talked a little too long. I apologize for that. Overall, the positives are great. GDP growth, labor markets, rising wages, exports, inflation, interest rates. Things are fine. Things are fine. On the other hand, negatives, labor shortages, housing shortages, the Fed, equity markets, the federal deficit, bank lending. But really, the scariest thing of all is right there on the bottom, which you could barely see, which is, yet again, miserabilism. The idea that we're running around pretending we desperately need jobs when we desperately need housing. Where we're running around worrying about a recession that's not going to happen while we steadfastly ignore the long-run challenge to our nation and infrastructure entitlement programs. I like to say that they call it the great disconnect. In a world where we worry about the number of jobs, where we need to worry about the number of workers. It's not who pays for health care, it's what we're paying for. Tax levels? No, it's tax structure. Income inequality? No, it's wealth inequality. Funded government liabilities? No, it's the unfunded government liabilities. Business investment? No, it's a lack of public investment. Inflation? No, it's slowing bank lending. Cost of California housing? No, it's the supply of California housing. It's amazing. We ask all the wrong questions. As an educator who's been in the business a long time, I'll tell you what, if you ask the wrong question, you're never going to get the right answer, ever, ever, ever. So start asking the right questions, because the right answers are obvious once you do. So stop worrying about the short run. Start worrying about the long run. Don't worry about where San Bernardino is right now. San Bernardino is on one of the most fantastic growth trajectories of any economy in the nation. The question is how do you build on this success? How do you build the housing to continue to fuel this amazing economic engine? So, before you leave today, I'm going to ask you to turn off the weapons of mass distraction, ignore the stupid headlines, the ridiculous reports, and the screaming miserabilism. Focus on the things that are really important, because once you do, you're going to see just how good things are and how much better they can get. Now, with that in mind, I am going to introduce the next speaker today, which is Adam Fowler. Where is Adam? Where is he? Adam? I think he's in back. All right. So Adam Fowler's been working with Beacon Economics for a couple of years. He's my director of research, and he's an incredibly bright young man. He's been doing some work out here with the county on labor force and labor force training issues. So, again, I'm talking about this idea that we do have a lack of workers here, and the way of thinking about how to deal with that lack of workers is, in one part, more housing to get more people here, but again, to reach into, if you will, the underbelly of the local labor market and figure out people who are not employed or underemployed and how to get them into this labor force to, again, help continue to push forward this great economic machine. So with that, everybody, Adam Fowler. You got to point pretty carefully at that thing, okay?
Is this the right one?
Yeah.
So like right.
All right.
Good morning. My name is Adam, and I am a millennial. Pew says I'm a millennial. I heard, I guess since everyone else has been doing a joke, I will start with one. Let's see. If every time I heard baby boomers, or in this case, Generation X, give millennials a hard time, if I had $1 for every one of those comments, I would be able to afford a house. In the economy and in the housing market, their policies ruined. So thank you very much. Here all weekend. I've only got about 15 minutes to talk, but I do want to talk a little bit about the bigger picture, longer term population issues, especially here in San Bernardino County. They're very important. Chris just went through a whirlwind of slides. We have a really amazing team of social scientists in the UCR Center. Chris is a macroeconomist. He's the big kind of global brain. But he has done an amazing thing. He's brought together social scientists across disciplines. And that really provides us a valuable set of skills to understand issues, not just from the macro sense, the hundreds of variables and data series you saw on those slides, but really dive in and understand the metrics under those macro issues. And what I want to talk today is a little bit the longer term time horizon. So we've got a good mix of public and private folks here in the audience today. And when we think about things like our long-term transportation plan, when we think about long-term policy implications, when we think about investing in our people that live here, those are long-term time horizons. So in Chris's short-term model, a couple days ago I had one of our forecast leads calculate the total number of variables that are active or inactive in our US model. 700 is roughly what number of series there are. Some of them are used, some of them go in and out. But as Chris's slide shows, there's a lot of variables out there in the economy. What's interesting though is when we think about 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, what we're really talking about is population dynamics and understanding what an area's population looks like. So let's see. Big takeaway, right? We're hitting records across all the top level numbers. Unemployment, beautiful in California. Lowest rate, 40 years, dabbles around depending on if we incentivize a few folks to rejoin the workforce given the increase in wages Chris was talking about. Job openings, that rate, another really strong look, and that's across industries. These aren't just professional services, these aren't science, management openings, where we think we need to have these brilliant minds maybe come in from across the Atlantic. These are up and down the industries. So hospitality, entertainment, some of those that require a lower kind of entry, a lower set of barriers in front of entering those industries, education credentials, et cetera. And employers are struggling to find talent. And that is real, as Chris mentioned over and over again. I believe the phrase was workers, 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 bodies, bodies, bodies. That's an important thing to think about. And I want to dive into San Bernardino specifically, as the opening speaker talked about, that labor force participation rate is a real anomaly. And our center, it's not one of those statistics that's easily downloadable, so the journalist can't do 2 clicks and write the story. We see those statistics all the time. This is a gnarlier data set that we had to work with over a long period of time to really understand what was going on in those different age cohorts and understand who was participating and who wasn't. And I think it's a problem that I want to raise a little bit of a flag about. I think it's worth thinking about, and I think it's worth really bringing groups of people together across public and private spaces to really put heads together. The status quo doesn't seem to be working, whether that's community colleges, old ways of thinking about workforce development. The new economic development, the new economic growth model is workforce development. You've got to strengthen your people in your local geography, and we're going to see here just a little bit about that. So I've got to aim this way. People without a job actively seeking work by more than 1.0 1.04 million. So that's the difference between the openings and that unemployment rate. Before March 2018, job openings had never exceeded unemployed workers in the 18 years we actually were able to capture those records at the federal level. That's kind of interesting. When we talk about the unemployment rate here in California, 40 years. We're breaking all kinds of records, and I think that's the backdrop to think about why things may be different, why underlying dynamics may be changing, and what we can do, whether it's public or private players, to really get our hands and brains to go and row in the same direction and pursue some really innovative and new solutions. So 3.9% in December 2018, we closed out the year, 49-year low if we're looking nationally. I'm going to boil this down to a really simple equation. I thought, let's dive into some of the industries, let's dive into logistics, let's dive into manufacturing. But what I want to dive into and leave you with today is investing in people. Because when I refer you to the report I hope everyone picks up, the participation rate and the lack of participation across working age population cohorts here in San Bernardino County is a huge untapped asset. And the numbers, while we may say it's 1, 2, 3%, and that we kind of conceptually think about that, the raw amount of possibility that exists here is really quite an untapped potential when you look at the industry breakdown in terms of number of people participating in manufacturing, in logistics that are here now. So, my little tiny equation for this brief conversation: human beings, important. Births, deaths, natural population growth. That's one part of the equation that we look at in Chris's long-term models. Our natural birth rate, what do we know about that? Well, people that are more educated have less kids. That's a global phenomenon. We're seeing that here generationally. Migration and immigration. If we quit having kids, let's bring them in from somewhere else. That's another option for people to participate in the economy, either as workers or as consumers. Their consumer spending drives a lot of the economy as well. That GDP number Chris started the presentation with, that's consumer spending that's been doing a lot of that work to drive that number. Participation is the second part of this equation. Rates which various groups participate in the economy. That's changed over time as women have entered the workforce, as other groups maybe culturally have changed the way their households operate. That number has shifted, and demographers are trying to get a better handle under that. But what we're seeing is a real shift in those cohorts and the way they participate. I want to come back to that point in a couple slides. That participation rate is that middle kind of equation there. If you want to think about that, there was this conversation around the passage of Obamacare that the participation rate, I think it was the first time I ever really saw it get kind of a really broad conversation in the national media around, oh, if people are able to stay on their parents' health care or they're able to access health care in other ways, people that are just holding on to their job may quit participating. They may opt out. Maybe they want to be a stay-at-home parent, et cetera. Participation and the kind of cultural indicators around that are important to think about. And finally, the workforce, the bodies. This is the backbone of the entire story. And these two things together is, I think, the real challenge for San Bernardino, the opportunity that exists here as it is. So what did we learn? Just the other day, the Department of Finance, the California Department of Finance, released California's population growth, slowest in recorded history since 1900. I think it was about 0.47 or so annual growth. Where are the babies? California sees slower population growth since it started counting. This is a state issue. It's not San Bernardino, but I want to bend that in that first category of the equation. I want to think about, if all else equal, we, California as well, maybe for the housing crisis, we can think about a number of variables on why people may be moving out or not moving in at the rates they were. Maybe that's policy at the federal level, but all said and done, we're seeing a number we've not seen since 1900. What else is really interesting, and I want to draw your attention to in the context of San Bernardino County? U.S. fertility rates by race. And this has been a really quick change that demographers 5 years ago, 10 years ago, really were kind of mixed on in terms of the convergence of fertility rates amongst ethnic cohorts. Nationwide, we're now at a sub-replacement level. You can see the top line there is Hispanic. The colors aren't very clear here, but we now converged with the other groups, and as a whole aren't going to be replacing ourselves if we want to keep the population at the status quo. An important fact to note that again goes into that bodies equation we talked about, and to Chris's point about workers, everyone is acting like everyone else in terms of lower birth rates across the board. The Department of Finance found 18,000 fewer babies born in 2018. California is not exempt from this national trend. Oh, this doesn't really show up. The labor force participation rate. So we've got bins here, as you can see, hopefully in the white. 16 to 24-year-olds, 25 to 44-year-olds, 45 to 64, 65 and over. The bars there and the axis on the left is taking the labor force participation rate amongst those age cohorts and subtracting it from that participation rate in neighboring counties, right? So a negative number says this group is participating at a lower rate than that county, that neighboring county. Blue, LA, I believe, I apologize. We've got LA Riverside, Orange, and LA here. So in only the 16 to 24-year-old category is San Bernardino outperforming in terms of participation rate. We expanded this analysis out to look across California. In our next year on this work, we're going to look at counties outside of the state because we couldn't find any good examples here in California. To Chris's point about you need to control for things, that's exactly what we tried to do. Let's look at places where incomes are similar, where educational attainment is similar, where demographics are similar. Even controlling for those things, I like to say Kern County, lower across all the things you think are correlated with active participation, outperforms San Bernardino across each of these cohorts. So we're trying to get our head around that, looking at other examples this year 2 of this kind of research engagement, but really quite stunning. Let me move forward one slide. The left-hand side there is number of workers. So if San Bernardino, if these age cohorts participated in the same rate as your neighbors, so Riverside, you know, this kind of hypothetical thought experiment that the kind of geopolitical boundary of a county line isn't enough to make a group of people act very different than people on the other side of the line. That kind of conceptual idea, what would it look like? And it ranges, depending on which county you're comparing to, between 33,000 and 108,000 people. So at the high end, Orange County, LA, if these age cohorts were participating at the rates your neighbors in those 2 counties were, you're looking at 100,000 extra people participating in the economy. That's not importing people. That's not doing anything different. That's having people participate that live here. And I would just, to ground that a little bit, percentages, I think, lose the kind of magnitude of that number. If you look on page 16 of the report you got, and we look at employment Q3 to 2018, total employment 750. We're talking about logistics industry, 81,000. You have an opportunity out there that's larger than your logistics industry, right? So that percentage point change feels kind of, I don't know, 100,000 people is a lot, prime working age people. And it's a huge opportunity, and it's an opportunity that's going to become more important as that context I talked about a little earlier on begins to impact all of us. If we're not having babies at the rates we were, if we're not importing people via migration domestically or international immigration, we got to bring our own people into the fold. We got to get folks participating. And it's an opportunity the size of the largest, strongest industries that Chris was talking about in terms of growing. I flag that as it's going to become more important to have those folks participating as some of those longer-term demographic trends begin to bear down. So, in conclusion, actually I'll run through these really quick because you can kind of see, and I'll make these slides available. I apologize for the color coordination here, but the pegging everything to 2010. So again, the context of what's going on is kind of remarkable, right? The number of adjectives Chris used to describe the great economic growth, which two things can be true at once, right? Both things can be true. We can have people not rebounding in terms of participating in the economy coming out of the Great Recession here in San Bernardino and have a bonkers economy. California leading the way, the insane numbers across top-level industries for San Bernardino, for the Inland Empire, all true. Yet we still haven't been able to bring people back in. Zero here would be back to the status quo pre the recession. Haven't been able to do it. We're looking here at index to, this is less than high school. You can see here, still going down. We're not even plateauing. Some of our higher educational folks doing a little better. Counties elsewhere not looking the same. If we look at bachelor's degree and above, still down. If we bend them by age 25 to 64. So I say all this to say that we need to think seriously about that. If the reality is that the economy at the top and highest level, the things we get excited about, objectively true, killing it, blowing up, amazing, and we have lost people, we've not been able to lure them back in. Increasing wages, Chris highlighted, true, still not able to bring folks back in. That is a real lift we have to think about in terms of private and public sector partners. 100,000 untapped individuals here. Really, I flag it in that I'm passionate about it. The center, we're passionate about better understanding this, but I want to flag it for all of you in this room and think about it as an opportunity. You know, for all the work we do around specific industry targeting, we need to think more broadly about this as an industry in and of itself at almost 100,000 individuals. So all we can do to really reach out and think about those people and prioritize them are only going to provide an opportunity as those longer-term demographic trends begin to really weigh down on this region along with the rest of the state and country. So thank you very much. I appreciate the few moments and the invitation to speak. Have a good rest of the morning. I will turn it back over to Chris.
So now is our opportunity, I think, or your opportunity rather, to go ahead and quiz Adam and I a little bit on your thoughts and comments or questions about everything we've talked about here. So, yes, go ahead.
So you talked about the concentration of high-rises in Irvine, downtown LA, and suggested that if we build those high-rises, then we'll have those kind of high-tech jobs. And the first thing I thought of was chicken versus egg.
That's a wonderful question. So the supervisor asked about the idea of job densification and how does one actually kick off the process. So it absolutely is the case, when you think about it, that we know these jobs are in these centers. I think the question is did they build those buildings because the jobs were there? I think that's what you're saying. And the answer is no. Because think about new sectors like, for example, information technology. You think about information technology jobs, which weren't even around 20 years ago, and they have largely located within those areas. So it's not like San Francisco wasn't there before Facebook discovered it. So historically speaking, it does seem as if those centers are there. But with that in mind, how does one kick this off? How does one make a plan? How does one move that in the future? And the answer there is I'm not quite sure. I mean, there's a lot of conversation to be had. Obviously, you don't do it overnight. We think about, for example, anything from Irvine, which is a master plan community that's been built over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, even to going back to the major Bunker Hill development in downtown Los Angeles and how many years that took place over. What I do know is there's really no place in the Inland Empire that has the zoning that could sustain such a growth spurt. And we also know something else, which is that government plays an enormously important role in this process, not so much because the government is going to decide that we want this building here or that building there, or we need this and that. But government's role in these kind of developments tends to be one of a center point of communication coordination. I mean, when you look into any of these communities, another big relatively new success story in the development front would be South Park in downtown Los Angeles, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, around where the Staples Center is. That is, again, probably one of the hottest economic growth zones in the state. And it is driven on the part of the fact that there was a lot of coordination. We need a centerpiece, the Staples Center. Around that, we need an entertainment zone. Around that, we need more hotels. Around that, we need retail. Around that, we need condos. Well, that didn't happen on its own. There are a lot of people in a lot of different industries who had to come together and be coordinated, and that coordination occurred because of the policymakers at the city and county level who were involved in that process. So there is no easy answer how you kick this off, but if you don't start having the conversation and get those people around the table to start having that conversation, and by the way, we'd love to be part of that conversation if it should pop up, that's when you start making those plans to build it forward. But it's a great question, by the way. It's a great question. Yes, sir. Well, okay, so the question is, you know, if there's a number of home buyers out there who have been waiting for prices to come down, what's going to get them off the sidelines? There's two answers to that. The first is the reality. Because if they think they're going to wait and prices are going to come down, they're going to be sorely disappointed. But more significantly, it really goes back to addressing something at the federal level and then something at the local level. At the federal level, a lot of the issue we're dealing with, of course, is the fact that those mortgage markets have been bogged down. You have, because of changes in the mortgage origination process, it becomes very hard for anybody with any kind of scars on their credit report to actually go out there and get a mortgage. And that's holding them back completely. But more significantly, let's think about here in California. Because, you know, it's not just the fact that there's a lack of units being built. It's also important to recognize that what is being built is, for the most part, high-end housing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I have a real problem with people who want to shut down the construction of high-end housing. Why do you want to shut down high-end housing? Oh, because working class folks can't afford that, so we shouldn't have it. But the problem with that sort of mentality is you don't build that high-end unit, then ultimately that high-income family is going to end up going and gentrifying another neighborhood. So you have to build those units. But nevertheless, when you think about the giant gap in the construction space, it's entry-level units. Right? It's that starter home. It's the first home that someone will have, that they'll start building equity on, that they'll start building up. It's the kind of home that this guy needs. Right? Oh, he's got a bunch of student loans. Trust me, I know. I'm paying them off for him, kind of. Come here. It's okay. It's okay. Anyway. But more significantly here, right? I mean, you got to think about that entry level, that kind of home, the micro home, the condo, as the case may be. And because of zoning, because of the cost of building, because of permit fees and everything else, you do have a situation where those units, those entry level units, are just not being built, and that's the gap that's preventing a lot of people from making the jump from renting into ownership. And again, it's a tough conversation. I mean, I'll give you a kind of a basic example on this, something that actually happened to me a couple of years ago in Rancho Cucamonga. So I've been looking around. I got little kids. I got to think about the future. So, okay, I'm going to come out the Inland Empire. I believe in this place. I'm going to invest in some property. So I'm looking around at property. I'm in Rancho Cucamonga. I found a beautiful half-acre piece of land with 5 lousy little apartments on it. And I'm thinking, what a great upsell. You buy this thing, you tear these things down, you put up 20 units. This is fantastic. I can't afford it myself, but I'll get some investment partners. So my real estate agent's all excited. He runs out. He starts checking it out. It turns out Rancho Cucamonga had taken that slightly over half an acre parcel of land and downzoned it to an R1. Oh, that's nuts. I mean, that's nuts. It's shockingly inefficient to take that big hunk of land. But let's go to the next step. Who's going to be able to afford an R1 on a hunk of land that big? Not Adam. Not an entry-level person. That's the kind of property, worst case scenario, what you want to do with it is you want to go in and you want to build, I don't know, 12 townhouses. Entry-level properties for people to buy, maybe at a reasonable fee, maybe $300,000-$400,000. Entry level, you get in, you start your family there. A few, 5, 6, 7 years later, when your job's getting better, you're making more money, you move to the next home. That entry level house is so critically important, and it's not being built. So it's a huge problem. The question is that because of policy or political will, and aren't those the same thing? I mean, aren't they? Right? Because you need political will to change policy. And to be clear, look, there's a bigger problem here, which of course has to do with the nature of the tax system in California. I mean, if you have a city manager, you sit down, you talk to him, and you say, well, we need more housing, you should build more housing. A city manager is going to tell you this. Look, 80% of my revenues come from my business sector. 80% of my expenses come from my residents. I don't want housing. That's bad for my finances. I want businesses because that's good for my finances. Every time you make me build an apartment complex, a workforce apartment complex, I put another fiscal nail in my coffin because I will not make back what that place cost me in terms of the social services I have to provide to them. So we have to get to the heart of the matter, which has to almost start in Sacramento, which is how do we incentivize cities to want more housing? And that's a tough conversation. And then, of course, you throw in the NIMBYism and everything else, and yeah, it does make these policy conversations. But remember, what you have here is a county, and everybody here is part of that county team. I mean, we have the county CEO, we have Reg here running development, and for them, it's a broader conversation. They need housing, they need jobs. And so they have to kind of help everybody figure this out locally to overcome those political burdens to make the right policy to make this work. Yes, sir. What do I think about FHA lending? Lending limits on the FHA. Look, I appreciate that the 450 is kind of low compared to California, but I don't think the lack of an FHA loan is the problem out here. Again, if you had more housing, if you had lots of housing prices would fall, and then the FHA limit wouldn't be so bad. The FHA limit works great in Texas. Over the last 20 years, Texas has built half again as much housing as California has off a smaller base. You can build lots of housing if there is the will. By the way, why does Texas build so much housing? Because local governments make their money off of property taxes. We don't out here. We force local governments to rely on their business sector. So you've built the system. So again, it's not a function of demand, it's a function of supply. Okay, yes, over here.
You kind of talked about it a little bit, but in regards to student loans, a lot of millennials stay at home because they can't maybe afford to move out. So because if there were more housing available, if there's been $6,000-$7,000 student loan payment, would that make sense without any reform of that?
Well, there's two things I want to take on. This is a millennial with lots of student loans, and he does not live with his parents. So that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, I would go to the next step. Most millennials live with their parents because where else can you get your laundry taken care of, your meals cooked for you, free TV, your parents pay your house insurance, your car insurance. I mean, yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. There's supply and demand, and I'm going to argue that's more of a demand than a supply problem, if you know what I mean, okay? So yeah, look, the millennial generation, there is a buildup of student loan debt in the U.S., but I think it's very important to understand that student loan debt, if it's used to get you a good degree, is the best investment you'll make in your entire life. The problem in student loan debt isn't that there's too much student loan debt, is that people aren't making good decisions with that money. It's an underwriting problem, right? I mean, look, we have a very functional banking system in the U.S. economy that works very well. But I can tell you right now that there's never been a bank in this world that you've walked into and they've said, hey, I tell you what, here's a check for $20 million. Chase your dreams, baby. Chase your dreams, okay? And yet that's what we're telling 18-year-olds. I mean, 18-year-olds aren't qualified to be making important lifelong decisions in the way we give them credit for. Borrowing $50,000 or $40,000 is an enormous responsibility. And you have to have the guidance. You have to understand that this money is not here to make your life fun. It's so you can have a great life by investing it wisely. So we all have to take a deep breath when it comes to student loan debt and start recognizing, and ultimately, if you borrow $150,000 and if you have a master's degree in electrical engineering at Stanford University, you're going to be fine. If you get $10,000 to get a half a certificate from a fly-by-night for-profit night school, you're not going to be fine. So this idea that we just lump all student loan together as it's the same thing and it's all bad and we should just get rid of student loan debt and make all colleges free, we're missing the point completely. It's not that. It's not that at all. Did I even go to your question after all that ranting and raving? But I mean, right? So I don't think millennials are trapped in their homes. I think that we simply need to help millennials make better decisions about their future and the educational investments they're making. Okay, she disagrees.
Thank you. I'm a millennial as well. I went to college. I have well over what you had mentioned for student loan debts. I feel like I made very good decisions. I work a pretty well-paying job. I was one of the fortunate ones to have the opportunity to not have to move back home. But I have many friends that live in poor, unsafe housing conditions because that's what they can afford. They have
Okay, hold on a second. Hold on. When I was your age, I lived in poor, unsafe housing conditions. Okay? When I was your age, I drove around in a 12-year-old used car that was a piece of crap. I know. Your life isn't any worse than mine. We all build from that. No, the cost of living has not gone up. That's completely untrue. No, your life is so much phenomenally better than mine when I was your age. The technology available to you, the entertainment available to you, the ability to travel, the ability to move, the ability to communicate, the health care you have available to you, your life is so much better than my life was when I was your age 30 years ago, miss. I'm sorry. But first thing millennials have to do is stop whining. All right. I apologize, but we're going to move on to the next question because, again, you have pretty good time to let things available to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarai Garrett, and I'm the marketing millennial. And my background is actually marketing research. And the reason why I found out I was a millennial was I drove this research. I wanted to know why are millennials disrupting markets? They don't love the same, they don't live the same, and they don't want to retire the same. So I teach about millennials. I know very much about the baby boomer generation because you can't know one without the other. I call the Generation X the middle child. So, with that
Power, middle children. Power.
being said, there are a lot of really, really great attributes that millennials bring to the table. I teach about that. I teach about kind of the psychology of a millennial. I also know that baby boomers, there is a big disconnect. Remember, baby boomers, you raised us. If you
I'm not a boomer, miss.
well, if you think we're whiny, who are our parents? And so, but with that being said, there is a big issue with education. Millennials actually
So is there a question here? Because, yeah. Yeah.
realized is that millennials are labeled because there is a misunderstanding. And so we talk about millennials, we look at millennials and we say, and even I said this before, I realized I was a millennial, right? I was like, they're entitled. Entitlement is not a millennial issue, it's a generational.
Okay, well, let me, okay, that's fine. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yeah. But I want to, hang on, wait. I want to be clear about something, though, okay? And that is something very clear. And I want to apologize to this young lady as well, because to be clear, millennials are whiny. In fact, they're the most whiny, entitled generation since mine. And mine was the most whiny, entitled generation since the boomers, and they were the most whiny, entitled generation since the greatest generation, and so on and so forth. Being whiny and over-entitled is what every generation goes through. In that sense, millennials are no different than anybody else. And I'm going to go back to one of my first points here. The issue I push back on here goes back to my very first comment I made, well, not my very first comment, but one of the last comments I made and one of the first comments I made, which is miserabilism. And if people are sitting around feeling like the weight of the world is on their shoulders and their shoulders alone, no, that's not what's going on. Never in the history of the United States have we been wealthier with more access to incredible resources and incredible quality of life, technology, entertainment. Never have we had it so good, and yet it doesn't take 10 minutes of conversation until it devolves into this plaintive whining. And whether it's the Xers doing it, the boomers doing it, the millennials doing it, stop. Stop. For once, stop. Appreciate what we have and focus on the things we need to work on. And that's where I start to get just, again, it's the right conversation in the right way.
Yeah, I would say I won't. Yeah, no, right. No. Here's the thing. I mean, I think we just need to be aware of what it means for industries that rely on lifestyle. Like at 38, I'm living with roommates. That's empirically different than previous generations. That's very different in terms of the real estate industry. All the kind of ripple out effects, my disposable income, what I do with it, like that I do think has an impact that changes industry dynamics. And so if we are delayed until our early 40s, like we need to keep that in mind, that it's just a real change.
Okay. Now, he knows I know a lot about his history and his attempt to get into the movie industry and the documentary which he made and the time you spent doing things before you put on a tie and came to work for me and grew up.
This is taking a turn.
So, but yeah, here's the upside. He's the largest voting cohort. He's also the future of our enterprise. So we love him to death and all that kind of stuff. But again, we have opportunities out there, and past generations have struggled with many of these same things that we've gotten ahead. Are there any questions out there? Last ones? Where? I'm sorry. I'm colorblind. Oh, way back there. God, I can barely see you. Please. About education, educational attainment. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay. A couple things that to keep in mind, okay? And it's a great question. I appreciate that. Education is a challenge here in the Inland Empire, but it's not the kind of challenge we think it is, and I'll tell you why. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, that when you think about the kind of jobs here and the type of workforce here, recognize that in many ways, that's a function of choices being made in the Inland Empire to do land loose. In fact, we've done studies on this. The more educated you are in the Inland Empire, the more likely you are to drive to San Diego or LA, Orange County. There's plenty of high-income, highly educated residents out here, but they don't have the job opportunities here they do in Orange County and LA, and they end up commuting. So it's important to recognize that training kids but not giving them job opportunities out of here functionally forces them to move out. And in a sense, by advancing these jobs that are being advanced here because of land use policies, you more or less just end up bringing more lower skilled folks in. And so what you're dealing with here is a broader question, which is, we all know, it's harder to get kids of low-skilled parents educated. That's understood. It's a challenge. And the Inland Empire is dealing with that in a way that maybe is out of alignment. I mean, look, in San Jose and San Francisco, it's not hard to get the kids educated for the most part, right? Out here, it's much more of a challenge, and there's a lot of good groups doing a lot of great work, and I applaud all of them on that kind of thing. So, but again, remember, that's more of a circumstance of the type of economy rather than, it's not that the economy is failing the workforce, it's just that the kind of economy it is builds this kind of workforce, as the case may be. With that in mind, your second question, which is about upskilling, is insanely important right now. Because, think about it. In a recession, you're just trying to keep people above water, keeping them from losing their home and going into bankruptcy. In the beginning of an expansion, for the most part, companies just grab people who are available, have good labor force skills, and even then, you're dealing with people just trying to get them some basic skills. You get into the proper expansion, and now you have opportunities to get people skilled, get some skills and get into the workforce and start building careers. Now, nobody's available. Now there's two things going on. One, you work with your existing workforce and teach them how to be better. I have a buddy of mine who runs hotels around the state, small hotels, boutique hotels, and what he tells me is this: I can still get cleaning people. My problem is managers. I can't keep a manager. So the solution here is to figure out how to take that cleaning lady who already has the job there and turn her into a manager. That's what you need to be focusing on right now. And the next step of that, of course, is something that Adam started to talk about. I'm going to let him talk about that. This is a great place to wrap up. But that, of course, is how do you take people who are still on the outside and bring them in? Because in a lot of ways, there is untapped potential in the Inland Empire, and right now what has to be done is figure out how to get those people into the workforce. You want to jump on that? Give me some ideas.
Yeah, I think Chris hit, I'm a big fan of upskilling. I think if you especially think about from a small business perspective, we're functionally a small business at the UCR Center. Anytime we hire someone new or have people that need to upskill, it's all we can do to teach them the UCR system, do our work, and get out before late in the evening. We don't have time to build out robust development plans, and we hear that all the time. We did a stakeholder outreach in Victorville here, and everyone talked about we're just, especially the small businesses, we're just doing kind of treading water to keep business in, deliverables out, keep the lights on, let alone strategically think about upskilling our people. A lot of people would. I mean, you can think about people that can't use iCal right, or Microsoft Office, or Salesforce, or all these things. There is that need where people need it. I think that's where the public sector can really, whether it's community colleges, whether it's workforce, build programs to help those small businesses do the things they can't do but would like to. We would love to send some of our researchers out for additional GIS training, but it's a lot of work to keep the lights on, do the day-to-day, and think strategically and do that kind of stuff. And it's the same public or private, especially when it's a smaller firm that doesn't have those really robust infrastructures. So I think any opportunity that's out there that can plug in with employers, I think there's untapped upskilling up and down our industries, and we really should, to Chris's point, lean in and try to help those folks that have the industry knowledge. There's a ton, even entrepreneurial type thinking within organizations. The people that make exciting technological advances know an industry really well, and they see a gap in the existing infrastructure, and they've got a set of competencies to activate that gap. They're not out in some sofa and sleeping on somebody's sofa dreaming up the next step. 9 times out of 10, they're already in the industry. They just need to be equipped to run with what they see as a problem. I mean, I take advantage of the researchers all the time in that they have the good ideas 9 times out of 10 because they're in the weeds. It's the same with private industry all across our economy, and I'm a huge proponent of upskilling and really investing in that. I think that's the future, and I'm excited about it. So anyway, I hope we can continue that conversation out here. I'll turn it back over to